Welcome back to the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Hello to the studio audience and especially to everyone joining us again online as part of the Sustaining Access, Refining Humanitarian Principles, Practice, and Policy for Today's Challenges conference here at CSIS. I'm really excited to be hosting this panel to talk about the Sahel. Specifically, we're going to be talking about preserving access in the Humanitarian-Development-Peace Nexus, this HDP Nexus. That's a very much a buzzword in the communities that we occupy. So I'm going to turn it over to our panelists soon, but I thought I would provide a little bit of framing first. We heard earlier from Jan Egeland and Sarah Charles about some of the major challenges, and one of the challenges that exists just as of last week is, I would say, Sahel adjacent, not exactly Sahel by most definitions, but what's happening in Sudan, I think, is a really good example of why access and sustaining access is such a critical thing for us to be considered. So as of a couple of hours ago, it seems like 420 people have been killed, 3,700 people have been injured, which creates an immediate crisis for those who are in the line of fire. But there's a broader crisis as well in Sudan, which is a country before fighting started where upwards of 16 million people needed life-saving humanitarian assistance. And now access to those people has also been cut off. So you can imagine that what you're reading in the news is about a certain number of people, and those people are in immediate danger. There are these much larger group of people that are in much more sustained danger. And I think when you just look to Sudan's west, to the Sahel, you have similar types of challenges in Burkina and parts of Mali and Chad. And so I think what I wanted to do was, starting with Sudan, was say, look, this is in the news right now, but this has been going on and unfortunately continues to go on around the Sahel, where upwards of 33 million, maybe more, people are in need of assistance, and that is a number that has increased by at least 25% over the past 5 years. Life expectancy in many places across the Sahel is much shorter than those of people around the world, and I think this is a place that is often overlooked, and so I'm grateful to the conference organizers for allowing us to spend this time to really dig in on the Sahel and to talk about this humanitarian development nexus. With me, I have Elena Ursu, who is a global access advisor with the Norwegian Refugee Council, and I'm just going around the table. I have Kumba Toure, who is the director of Open Mali, which I learned that Open actually is an acronym, which I will not offend you nor the audience by trying to actually pronounce the acronym. And then we have Archibald, or Archie Henry, who is a program officer for Central Africa and the Sahel with the U.S. Institute of Peace. So Kumba, I would love to start with you. When we talk about this humanitarian development peace nexus and access challenge, I would love your broad thoughts. You live in Mali, your NGO works in Mali. Tell us a little bit about your work that you do there. Tell us a little bit about the challenges that you're facing in Mali and how you see these issues.
All right, so thank you for having me here. I work for a nonprofit organization called Open Mali. Many people think Open Mali is actually Open Mali, but it's actually Oui pour une enfance noble. That's the acronym.
I'm really glad I didn't try to pronounce it.
All right, so it means yes for a noble childhood. Open Mali was the first association in Mali created by young people. It was actually high school students ranging from 15 to 16 years old who actually got together and decided they wanted to create an association to actually help children go to school. So the first work line of the association was for education, sending as many children to school as possible. So now we have extended a little bit because the reality has changed, right? So we are kind of focused on health, on women empowerment, on the promotion of citizenship, on actually educating young people about different realities in Mali and putting them on the right path. So Open Mali is mainly that kind of association now. So since 2019, the association got the agreement to become an NGO. So we got the receipt from the Ministry of Territorial Administrations in Bamako. And we are on the field, I would say. So we are facing a lot of realities in Mali. Open Mali work with many international nonprofit organizations based in Mali. So since France actually left Mali, it's been kind of hard for many national NGOs because we are a national NGO in Mali. So it's been hard because financing and many other things are very hard to find. And for the people on the field, they face the reality every day. So they have to face the insecurity issues on the field. They have to face many other reality on the field. So I'm glad I'm here today to talk about those issues so we could find some kind of solution to them and stuff. So, yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about what those challenges facing youth are in Mali? You know, frame the context for us. I know very little about Mali other than what happens in Bamako is very different than what happens in Timbuktu. But so frame that a little bit for us and how you as a Malian NGO are positioned to actually address those needs.
Youth, the main issue the youth is facing is the struggle to find their own voice in the Malian society. Because usually young people do not really have access to primarily have a voice or decide in the government matters and things of that nature. So that's mainly one of the problems the young people are facing, especially with the political side of things. You're gonna find politicians or even Malian officials going toward young people. That's when they need them to probably help them with the elections and things of that nature. They make a lot of promises to young people. But once elected, these young people are kind of put to the forgotten side of things. So we are really struggling to find the voice that we deserve. And also, unemployment is a very big issue in Mali today. More and more young people are shifting toward doing drugs and things of that nature. I'm talking about that because I'm a person who actually lives in the Malian society. On my streets, I see young people sitting there from 9 a.m. to 4 a.m. every day, you know, doing drugs. You see them selling drugs and stuff. So that's some of the issues that we have to really address to really, I would say, help these young people have something very serious to do, like professionally or even, you know, how to say it, help them really build themselves as individuals and stuff. So yeah, that's what I would say. And on the field, the people who are not in Bamako, for instance, in the regions, those people struggle to find the opportunities that they deserve because they're not heard, they're not seen. So local authorities, most of the times, do not really go to the villages and things of that nature. So yeah, we kind of, as an NGO, we try to, you know, give a voice to those people as much as possible so they can be heard and seen by international NGOs as well as Malian authorities as well. So yeah.
That's really interesting, and I think for a lot of us that work in this space, we expect your first answer to that question to be jobs. That was your second answer. Yeah. But I think your first answer being a voice, that's really powerful. And so it sounds like you're doing incredibly important work. Elena, you're the Global Access Advisor for this region. This is a conference on access. So I would love for you to talk about your work at the Norwegian Refugee Council, and especially about your thoughts on this HDP nexus as it exists, or maybe doesn't exist, in the Sahel.
Thank you very much for having me on the panel, and I'm very glad that NRC and CSIS came together to organize this very topical and very timely conference on humanitarian access. Since Kumba has so described the Malian context, I would like to move a little bit to the east and speak, maybe just paint another image of the neighboring country, Burkina Faso, right? And I would like to illustrate and to maybe discuss together a paradox that we're living there. This morning we heard Jan Egeland and Sarah Charles speak about a number of access constraints and a number of these very technical categories of constraints. And some of them were about assertive governments and bureaucratization, right, of the humanitarian space. And this is the phenomenon we are assisting to in Burkina Faso. And this is what I would like to bring forward today. And I'm just going to give you a couple of numbers for you to assess the entity and the gravity of the situation. In 2022, we had 5 areas in Burkina Faso that were blockaded, right? When we speak about a blockaded area, we speak an area from and to which civilians don't have freedom of movement. So they cannot leave and go back into this area to access public services, to receive assistance, right?
This is Burkinabe or international or both?
This is for the Burkinabe citizens.
Wow.
And we're speaking now of an increase to 23 such areas. So an estimate of 800,000 people that live in these areas without access to assistance and to public services. And this is one dimension. There's another dimension, which is in June 2022, after a sequence of transitions from a coup d'etat to the other, we assisted to the creation of ZMI, military interest zones. These zones are particularly interesting as they are formed in the north and east of Burkina Faso, and they're designated by the military. And how they work is that the military would give 14 days to civilians, including the civilians that have lived there their entire life, to quit the area completely. 14 days. And to date, we have no exact number, no approximation even, of how many people left those areas, so were displaced, and how many people stayed in spite of these injunctions. And so what I want to bring forth is that in a lot of the cases in the Sahel, there are a lot of people that we do not see. But because we do not see them, it doesn't mean there are no needs, and it doesn't mean that our efforts to access them shouldn't be forthcoming. Especially in a situation in which humanitarian access is highly constrained by bureaucratic impediments. To give you yet another example, we heard today several intervenants speaking about cash-based assistance, right? Which is one of the most empowering forms of humanitarian aid because it gives flexibility and it recognizes, right, the agency of people that receive this assistance. Consider that in Burkina Faso, assessments in 2023 found out that there are 4.6 million people that not only are in need of this assistance, but they're entitled to receive it. In January 2023, one of the military governors of one of the regions decided these interventions, this cash-based assistance, was not appropriate any longer because they had concerns regarding aid diversion, because they had concerns on the impact of this assistance on social cohesion, and ultimately because they wanted to reassess how this assistance was working. But this had a very strong impact because it was a practice that appeared overnight. And it was a very contagious practice because now, in April, we have 3 major regions in Burkina Faso that are practicing the same prohibition. So among the 4.6 million people that are supposed to receive this type of assistance, and we're speaking of a value of more or less $260 million of assistance, half of this is in the regions that now forbid this type of assistance. So we're speaking of assistance that we are not able to deliver in spite of needs. And to conclude just on this crescendo of humanitarian access constraints, we are also looking at the criminalization of humanitarian aid with a series of increasing incidents, both in number and in severity, that are coming from those who should facilitate humanitarian actors. So when I started answering to your question, I mentioned a paradox. Because many in this room and in the virtual audience, I bet they expected an answer more related to non-state armed groups and to that type of narrative. Our paradox is that today, our biggest constraints are not frontline negotiations with non-state armed groups, but to obtain the buy-in, the acceptance, and the consensus of defense forces, so the army, and the state apparatus, so authorities. So this is a little bit where the situation lies in Burkina Faso at the present moment.
Yeah, so I want to come back to both you and Kumba about, as operational NGOs, how do you deal with those more state-based constraints? People that should be facilitating this access are the ones that are denying it. I always like to think about it's easier to turn off the tap than it is to turn it back on, especially when you're using words like terrorism and diversion and things like that. So I would love some thoughts on how you navigate that in your operational. But first, I wanted to turn to a fellow tank thinker over at the U.S. Institute of Peace. Archie, you have lived in sub-Saharan Africa and you have worked on these issues for a number of years, and so would welcome your thoughts on HDP Nexus and the Sahel and how you think about this issue set.
Sure, thanks a lot for having me. And so at the U.S. Institute of Peace, we work across the Sahel region supporting civil society actors to build community resilience to violence, to radicalization, countering hate speech, for example, and also supporting peaceful and inclusive political transitions through policy dialogue and looking at issues around elections, security sector reform, accountability and governance, and those are some of the areas we work on in those contexts. Across that work, we also try to make the connection between sort of like local level concerns and community grievances and national policy conversations occurring in the capitals of these countries. I think it's a really important angle of this work, and I'd love to touch a little bit on this. Some trends we observed, and I think that are helpful in this work. I think one is to support local frontline organizations, including youth, women, customary leaders, traditional leaders, and so forth, and trying to build up also networks of civil society and coalitions and platforms, something that's been quite helpful in having different organizations come together in their respective countries and trying to find the entry points to decision makers or to armed groups and try to push for the change they want to see. Sometimes we've noticed that civil society initiatives can be disconnected, so it's important to support that coordination. Or there's a disconnect sometimes between government and ministry efforts and civil society efforts, for example, in community violence reduction. So at USIP and other partners, our role can be to actually try to bridge that gap wherever it's helpful. USIP and USG funding can try to support local civil society to get access to those decision makers and try to ensure that policy and practice on access and on a variety of issues is informed by the citizen views and citizen concerns. I think a second area that's important to touch on is policy dialogue is critical, and we can't address these questions without investing and engaging in inclusive political processes wherever that's possible. So trying to talk to as many organizations and actors as we can. We understand that some organizations, it's not always easy to do that, especially operational humanitarian actors. But in our work, try to build and maintain those connections with governments, opposition, security sector, religious voices. And when we do have that access that others might not have or might be reticent to use, try to amplify messaging or priority concerns wherever that can be useful. So, for example, on protection of civilians, on the need for social services in a given area, on access, on social cohesion as a critical vector for countering extremism and prevention. I think a third area that's important to look at is, again, connecting the local level and the national policy conversations, and bridging sometimes a disconnect and understanding between the conversation happening at the capital and in the field. And we experience that across the world. This is not unique to the Sahel. So when we look at political transitions, there are thematic issues of concern for the citizens: security sector reform, accountability, reconciliation, and ending the violence and the conflict. But security sector reform, for example, these conversations need to include significant consultations at the local level with the citizens, with the local authorities, to understand what would be the concerns of security sector reform and how would that play out right here, right now. These conversations can't happen in a silo, so it's important to feed those local perspectives into the capital level discussions, and vice versa too. I mean, when we talk about intercommunal violence, which is definitely a trend and an issue across many of these countries, it can also be a catch-all phrase or a convenient term that decision makers can use to sort of distract from the real root of the problem at hand, and you can't disconnect that from the political context and influential individuals or politicians being actively involved in the cattle business and movement of cattle, which is a lucrative enterprise, and sometimes fueling those tensions at the local level. So how do we have those conversations, whether it's in Ouaga, Bamako, or in N'Djamena, around what needs to change by supporting the local actors and local civil society, around security sector reform, around modernized agriculture and pastoral herding, around infrastructure, economic development, jobs, or even subnational governance and local governance, and what do the people want to see? And then at the same time, try to find creative local solutions to mitigate that kind of local intercommunal violence, quote unquote, such as information sharing mechanisms or deconfliction mechanisms, where farmers and communities would get information on the number of cattle coming in at a certain time or at a specific location, and trying to build better predictive capabilities for those threats and risks. So, having that local level engagement, but also not disconnecting that from the political problems, and having those conversations at both levels, I think is critical.
USIP is a think and do tank. You work with local civil societies, and so are you, when you're doing this type of work and outreach to local communities, are you facing impediments? Are you facing access challenges?
I don't think we face as many of the issues as operational, humanitarian organizations, and there's they need to maintain their impartiality, and there's some of those questions too. I think in many cases, peace builders might have more access than in other cases. Obviously, there's going to be security restrictions that affect all organizations. In some cases, we notice, like in the tri-border area between Sudan, Chad, and CAR, significant access constraints, and in those cases, the need to engage with non-traditional actors and customary leaders to gain that access and to build that trust. And I think this is also applicable to the tri-border Liptako-Gourma region as well. We operate in sort of different levels across the region and across these contexts, at capital and field level. But yes, there are absolutely access constraints. In northern Burkina Faso, for example, it's complicated to implement any sort of programming, so that's significantly restricted by security concerns or government prohibitions on certain forms of programs.
And to double click on those government prohibitions, I want to come back to the both of you. When you do face actors that theoretically should be responsible for the provision of services, and those actors are blocking those services, how do you work with that? How do you deal with that? Because it's a nation state, and there's principles of sovereignty involved, and certain respect, and folks that look like me going into places where these folks are is maybe not the hey, you should give us access is not maybe the best way of doing it. So how do you navigate that?
Actually, as a national NGO, we try to really comply to the rules set by the local authorities. For instance, Elena was talking about the cash assistance thing. You might probably want to know, already know, the government of Mali has blocked many things when it comes to that. Cash assistance is actually not a thing anymore in Mali. And there's this system put into place called avis de non-objection. So you have to go through that now as an NGO, whether you're a national NGO or an international NGO. You have to actually have the agreement of the government before taking any step to help on the field to put any actions into place and stuff. So those are the issues that us and other NGOs face nowadays in Mali. But what can you do? You have to comply. You have to try to work with the local authorities. You have to try to, make them trust you in some kind of way, make them see the work, the goodwill that you have behind your actions and stuff. So those are the things that we have to go through. It's a whole process. And sometimes that avis de non-objection takes time. It can take months before we can actually, we can actually get those agreements in order to act on the field. So those are the challenges that we face, but I cannot really say anything else but, try to comply and try to work on a dialogue, on communications with local authorities on the field. So, yeah.
I think that building trust piece is really critical, and I think in Errol's ideal world, you build that trust and then you show those trusted government interlocutors how these bureaucratic impediments are actually affecting your ability to operate. Then they realize, and then that has a knock-on effect with other groups. Because I think what is a barrier, I think, to some in these types of environments is you have some groups that are really good at building trust, and some groups that are not as good at building trust or don't prioritize it the way that you seem to. And so I think people need access to services and the other good works. So.
And that's actually the reason why I always try to put the accent on international NGOs working with national NGOs. Because I would say we have more chance or more opportunities to build that trust with the local authorities than probably some international NGOs. So when you work with national NGOs, you kind of facilitate that dialogue with the local authorities and stuff, and national NGOs, as national NGOs, we are more aware of the reality in the society and on the reality on the field, because we have teams in those localities and stuff who do the job for us and stuff. So when you work with national NGOs, you make it easy for yourself, facilitate the dialogue and communication with, the government, for instance. So, yeah.
I think you're going to get very little pushback from this table on that statement. But Elena, I would love your thoughts on this, sort of working with government partners as well.
Yes, Kumo will not get any pushback, especially from us, where we have an eminent person as the Secretary General, and we're very much pushing for localization, right? And for recognizing not only the role in partnerships with international organizations, but also the standalone role of national NGO as first responders being embedded, right, in the societies that they serve and work with. I want to go back a little bit to your question on how do we deal with this, because definitely as an international NGO, we deal with it a little bit differently, right? Because we don't have that degree of societal embeddedness. So one of the things that we try to do at NRC is to push for more collective alignment and collective action, right? So let me go back to the cash-based intervention example. What we have done is when we realized that the situation was escalated beyond, right, a manageable point, we went back to a negotiation table. And then we said, let's have a workshop in which we can discuss how did these constraints come about? Are they legitimate? And in some cases, they are. There are fears that we have to respect, that are fears from authorities that have more or less knowledge about how we operate, that we have more or less understanding of all of these complex systems that we're trying to deploy to all of these areas, that have suspicions of all sorts of kinds. We have to go back to that negotiating table, right? To negotiate access, nothing else but principled humanitarian access, right? And so now, on my example, we're going to meet the 12th and the 13th in Ouagadougou with the relevant ministries and with the relevant authorities to go back to a common understanding. What do we do? Why we do it? And then build that trust again. The other thing that we try to do for as much as possible is to show the impact both of our work and of the lack of assistance, right? What does it mean for people not to receive assistance anymore, right? Who is going to take on that subsidiary duty, right? And provide assistance to the people that are in need, to the people that have no other remedy, right? Whose dignity has to be respected and preserved in conflict and in natural disasters and in no matter what state of vulnerability. So showing the impact of lacking this assistance is very important, because this is when you build what Kumba was saying, right? That trust and that empathy, right? At the very end, authorities in Burkina Faso, in Niger, in Mali, in Chad, in any country, right? They have not only the primary duty of providing assistance, but they also have the interest for their people to be safe, right? And to receive this assistance. What we want to show is that the way in which we work is complementary, right? And we are not diverging, right, in objective. We're just doing it differently. We're doing it based on principles. Principles are not something that we keep repeating because we're bound to IHL and we're very compliant with IHL. It's our bread and butter. Operational principles, operational independence, neutrality, impartiality, humanity, which is what drives our assistance. This is what guides every single step, every single mile that we take when we are in the field. And this is what we have to preserve. And preserving this means also legitimizing authorities' concerns. And instead of saying, you are locking or blocking my access, is to say, I'm trying to understand where that comes from. And I'm trying to demonstrate that I'm not feeding conflict, right? I am not causing harm. I'm trying to protect, through assistance, the civilians that are in need, and no matter what type of vulnerability they're lying in.
You talked about getting all the relevant partners together and then taking a principles-based approach to humanitarian access. And Archie, I was wondering, from a more civil society engagement and peace-building lens, which you talked about, do you think the peace-building community, this is a panel that talks about the Humanitarian-Development-Peace Nexus, do you think the peace-building community takes a similar approach? What can they learn? What can these various communities learn from one another with regards to accessing these tough places?
Yeah, I think one of the big areas I think where we can improve our collaboration understanding is what are the different kind of sensitivities that we all face when engaging with actors on the ground, whether that's the government or that's security forces. What are the specific granularity in language and understanding of these contexts that we, as I mentioned earlier, we can have access to non-traditional actors, which humanitarians also have. We can speak to government officials, opposition, but even then, that can also be tricky. I think it's about, as you mentioned earlier, building trust and finding sort of the common entry points and why this issue, why building peace, why preventing hate speech or countering hate speech matters, to the stakeholder, to the government. Why is it in the interest of security? And I know this is a tension also across the aisle, because in some cases you can't necessarily use sort of national security arguments to make the case for access. And that's an eternal sort of debate, I know, in the humanitarian sphere. But how do you find that language that is still making the case in terms of what are the interests for you to enable access. And I think that's an area where we can further collaborate. There's different kind of approaches and practices that have worked well. In my prior job in the humanitarian community at Interaction, right across the street, we worked with an array of human rights and humanitarian organizations, some peacebuilding organizations, to try to find sort of common recommendations on protecting civilians and the protection of civilians. And sometimes not using like legalistic language can be helpful in advancing your messaging. And what are how do you phrase that in operational terms for military actors, political actors? Why does it matter to them, while at the same time being conscious of not jeopardizing your principles? So,
yeah, I think it's hard in humanitarian context. Time is lives, and so taking the time to actually build that trust and develop those relationships, and then on the peace building side, making sure that you're also dedicating time, which brings me back to something that Elena said, the critical importance of the local folks who are on the ground building that trust in an ongoing way. I want to take this opportunity to ask folks online and in the room. We are taking questions, and in fact, we have a really good one. I was going to ask you about climate change, and thankfully Jessica from OCHA beat me to it. So I'm going to read this question. She thanks the participants for a varied conversation. I would be interested in hearing how each person is seeing climate affect their work and whether adaptation to climate change in a place like the Sahel needs to be raised as an equal pillar to humanitarian peace and development. So a quadruple nexus, if you will, understanding that it needs to be woven through each. So maybe Kumber or Elena, I'll bump it over to you.
Sure. Definitely climate change is something that we're looking at because it has global relevance, and we understand it's multiplying. It's a compounding factor that has a multiplying effect, right, on the challenges that we already have, but more importantly, on the vulnerability of the people that we work with and that we serve. I want to bring up an example that was very clearly mentioned by the WASH cluster, the Water Sanitation and Hygiene cluster of Burkina Faso. And so when they were analyzing the situation on the ground, what their analysis turned out to be is that by 2050, there will be 7.3% less rainfall, right? And there's going to be 1.7 degrees higher temperatures. Now, for regions that are already extraordinarily hot, that is very significant. But what is more significant is that the impact that is going to have on their livelihoods, the impact that is going to have on the already very scarce resources that displaced communities and people forced to flee have access to, and to the communities that are hosting them. However, I also want to be devil's advocate on this topic, right? Because we also have in the sector the tendency to like nex up everything. So you said quadruple nexus. I think by the end of
it
this
gave
discussion,
us all a headache when I said that.
Yes, yes. So we can have like an nth level nexus, right, by the end of this conversation with the help of the audience. But I would also like to stress something that is very important and critical. When we look at why people are being forced to flee and displaced across the Sahel, and Kumba, I would very much like to also hear from you and what's your take on this. Insecurity, attacks, violence, threats of violence are the most frequent cause, which doesn't mean that climate change is not having an effect, but it means that the most immediate trigger for displacement, which is the focus and the mandate of the organization that I work for, the Norwegian Refugee Council, is something that we have to address immediately. And so, of course, we need like more structural engagement when it comes to climate change. I cannot speak from a place of authority. I have no legitimacy to delve into climate change challenges because I have no scientific background, but it's something that I want to stress. Insecurity and attacks force people to flee. And this is the number one cause that we see so far. And so maybe Kumba will have
Yeah, absolutely. I absolutely agree with Elena. as a person who's there in that reality and sees that reality, the primary thing in Mali, I can only speak on the account of Mali, like Elena said, the urge is with the insecurity and the attacks. Yes, climate change does exist because Mali is partially a society of agriculture and fishing and things of that nature. So of course, each year we see the impact that climate change has on the country itself. But when it comes to humanitarian or the security side of Mali, on population facing war, the main reason why they are internally or even externally displaced sometimes is the insecurity, is the attacks, is the, poverty, I would say. Not even a week ago, like last Saturday, April 22nd, we've had attacks in Mopti, the region of Mopti, where many civilians died. So that's actually a reality right now. So many people from that region had to leave their home, their villages to come to Bamako. And in Bamako, the refugee camp that we have there, Elena must have probably been there sometimes and stuff. The living conditions are very, very hard to see, very, it's very,
They're harsh.
harsh, exactly, harsh. So that's the priority. Like, what solution can we find in those people facing those attacks and things of that nature, the violence and stuff. So that's actually the reality. So when you ask me about climate change, I'm gonna say yes, everybody's facing climate change in Mali. Whether you're in a conflict zone or not, yes, the rain that came last year is probably not gonna be the same rain this year, but the reality is the conflict, the violence going on in Mali right now, and that should be the priority. Yeah.
Climate change.
In complete alignment with both panelists, and I think it's important also that we look at some medium and long-term planning around climate and weather events. So if we know that temperatures will rise by 1.5 or 1.7 Celsius in the next 10 years, what are some disruptions that might occur, even if we can't predict every single episode of extreme weather? Already last year, we saw some really significant extreme weather in the region and flooding, severe flooding in many cities as well. Jamena and Dakar, and systems are already strained. The health systems are strained. Often governments and militaries are not always, don't always have the capacity to respond to these shocks, and are busy tackling security crisis and other issues. So how do you look at those safeguards and build that capacity when international security support or bilateral aid will need to take into account, I think, some of those possibilities for extreme weather, how that can exacerbate or fuel tensions and conflict. When you look at Chad, for example, it's a country with, I think, nearly 100 million heads of cattle in a country of 20 million. So something needs to be done around the question of transhumance routes and corridors, around arable land and grazing rights, and what are some agroforestry options and working with small farmers and some ways to support them that are sensitive to climate. But again, when you have a problem that big and deeply political crises across these contexts, you cannot dissociate climate and climate-fueled conflict from the political conflict. It's important to engage at all the levels and have that climate lens in our work, including in our policy and political engagement. I think it's absolutely critical.
And also, I would like to add this thing. Sometimes while putting into action some humanitarian works and stuff. One of the biggest mistakes that probably international NGOs or foreigners make in Mali is, you know, when you go on the field and you're trying to probably, you know, give access to water in a place, you have to talk to the locals to actually study the reality. What are they facing right now? What are their needs right now? What should we do to help you? Not just go on the field and just, you know, do what you want to do because that's the plan that you have put into place and stuff. And also taking into account, as an NGO, we actually taking into account the environmental aspect of things. If you're trying to actually create more employment or, you know, form people in fishing or agriculture and stuff, we have to measure the impact on the environment and what are going to be the downside of things after we finish, you know, building, you know, this in agriculture or a garden for people to use and stuff. So those are things that NGOs have to take into account while on the field, I would say. Yeah.
Yeah. Look, I wasn't present at the creation of the organizing principle that has become HDP Nexus. But my guess is that the peacebuilding community builds peace. Liberia, other places around the world where this has been a success, or even if it's not a national success, localized success. The humanitarian community keeps people alive. They do it really well. The development community thinks longer term. And I'm vastly oversimplifying for the sake of making the point that I'm about to make, which is those communities of practice maybe didn't have tea together all that often. And so this idea of a nexus, I think, is to bring people out of their day-to-day, to have those humanitarians who, yes, are thinking for 99% of their time about immediate assistance and conflict and drought relief and things like that, and getting them to meet with those international financial institution representatives in Bamako. And to meet with the peacebuilding community. And maybe you can find some ways of when you're building peace, you're also providing humanitarian services in a way that leads to more sustainable development. I will now take off my idealist hat, but I think that's the point. And this leads me to actually a great audience question from Hazem, who is with the American Relief Coalition for Syria. And Hazem says, from this discussion, I think it's fair to ask, is there actually a functioning HDP nexus being implemented in the Sahel, or is it still stuck on this humanitarian component?
I'm happy that there's still people in the audience that are smiling along with me. This is the million-dollar question, right? Does the HDP work? I don't know. But I can reflect together on how we're seeing it in certain areas. Of course, what we want to stress is that in this context that are fraught with difficulties for people to have their rights respected, to access public services, to access assistance, to be able to have hope and look forward to the future, which is what Kumba was saying, right? There is a space and a place for every and each one of us at this table and beyond. Everybody has an added value. I want to complexify a little bit the role of humanitarians, right? We're not only saving lives, we're not only day one there. We're also working towards that future. We also believe the youth not only deserve, but they have to have that future. Yeah. In Niger, for instance, 3 out of 4 people, children, that are born in displacement don't have birth certificates. We're 4 people at this table. The 3 of you do not have birth certificates. So you have access to no public service, no health care, no education. You will not be able to graduate any level of school. You will not be able to assert your identity. You'll not be able to vote. You're not going to be able to do absolutely, you're not going to be a functioning citizen. This is what we're investing in, right? Does a birth certificate save somebody's life per se in that moment? No, but it gives an opportunity to a quality life, right? And so we're moving away from that immediate relief into more sustainable forms of assistance, into durable solutions, and into rights-based approaches that give that hope, that maintain that hope, right, for people. And so, yes, there is a space for all of us. What I want to stress when it comes to the HDP is the implementation. Hazem has a very good question, like, does it work in the field? How do we all coexist together? This is the thing. We still have to learn how to coexist in very complex crises. In Mali, you have an integrated UN mission, peacekeeping mission, and then you have humanitarian responders, and then you have UN agencies with a humanitarian mandate, and then you have a lot of researchers and policy researchers and policymakers, and then you have peace builders, and then you have humanitarian organizations that have a peace building component to their activities. Everything is there. The problem is, you said something earlier, Errol, on the lines of, well, communities really need that assistance, so will they make that distinction between who's who? They do. In a lot of communities that have been living with conflict at their doorstep and have been surrounded by conflict and lived maybe their entire lives in that conflict, trust is very important. So that trust doesn't have to be trust only between us as organizations and our counterparts as local authorities, national authorities, non-state armed groups, other parties to the conflict. First and foremost, we need the trust of the people that we work for, what we used to call the beneficiaries, right?
Yeah.
The people that we serve with our assistance. And people need to trust us in order to obtain, to have access to our assistance and for us to access their community, right? Their households. And so they do make the difference. They do make the difference because they understand the mandates, they understand how we operate as humanitarians, and so we have that network of trust, right? Some other interlocutors, like peace builders, they don't have the same frequency, for instance, of travel to these regions. They don't have the same types of engagements, sort of in the lines of what Archie was saying earlier. Even if we have the same interlocutors, we don't have the same objectives, right? And so very often they do make that difference. And so what we work on is acceptance. Acceptance of what communities see in us and what they understand, right, as being our mandate and the assistance we provide. And that is the key to all of this. Not all actors along the nexus have this as a priority. We do have it because acceptance protects the people we serve and protects us as staff of this organization. So I think this is maybe a little bit the subtlety of the difference. But
that Niger example that you gave, did that come just out of NRC's programming, or was that part? Because that's the type of thing that it seems like should come out of a HDP Nexus process. Is like, oh wait, 3 or 4 people don't have this document that's actually a really critical document. I can see how that would be organically just in the humanitarian space, but also something that could come out of an HDP Nexus.
well, maybe that's our way of doing the Nexus. No, this is our flagship programming, which is information and legal counseling and assistance. And so it's something that we invest everywhere, just because having civil documentation gives access to the wide array of public services.
Yeah.
So first and foremost, to children, to education, public service, healthcare, and all the rest.
Yeah,
So.
immediate and longer term assistance.
Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely.
And as a national NGO that have the first goal was to send children to school, we have faced a lot of cases like that in Mali as well, where children, you have children who did not have any birth certificate. So the humanitarian aid that we brought to them by sending them to school allowed us to actually create the birth certificate for them. So that means that it's very important, the works that we do, because those are issues that we identify with our works and stuff. So yeah, I just wanted to come back to that. It's very much a reality where children, you have even adults who still don't have birth certificates in the Sahel region, in Mali, for instance. So bringing aid, identifying those people, help us to actually regularize their situation and help them as much as we can. So yeah.
I want to come back to this HDP Nexus question to both of you, but Kumba, since you have the floor, is this 5-letter word Nexus, is this a sort of a capital city, international capital city donor conversation, or is this something that you're thinking about at the national level or even at the local level as being important, this whole idea of coordination amongst those three different types of programming?
Well, as a national level, we think it's very important as well. It's all, as a national NGO, it's very important to us to think like international NGOs do and stuff. So that makes us, that allows us to think broader and identify broader issues that we can probably partake in and work with international NGO to fight against and stuff. So yeah, it is something that we think about as well and stuff.
That's great.
Yeah, I think in answering the question around does the HDP Nexus work in the Sahel, I think there's two parts to that. And as you were both saying, I think some organizations are actually seeing a diversification of their activities and their sectors of intervention. As the NRC example shows, organizations I'm thinking like Mercy Corps that are engaging on various fronts, development, peace, across the board. But at the same time, can we think of joined up programming in the Sahel between our actors? And it's very rare, very infrequent, maybe never, almost never happens. It happens sometimes, but programs between a development organization, humanitarian organization, a peacebuilding organization. If you look at the organizational level, maybe at the local level in a specific area, the HDP Nexus maybe, yes, this does work in that regard. In terms of like overall collaboration between different actors, those practices and processes are not in place. It's not automatic. It's particularly challenging, and there's funding questions, and it's very competitive. So there's a ton of reasons why it doesn't really work at the broader scale, but it does sometimes work in those cases, with one or two organizations specific project. I'm thinking of a case at the northern tip of CAR, which is maybe slightly beyond the Sahel, but Sahelian climate in Samwanja, where I think after many, many years, MINUSCA was able to sort of root out, MINUSCA is the UN peace operation in the country, root out sort of armed groups which had been operating there and predatory. This is an area where I think the Prime Minister had visited, and people did not recognize him because of how disconnected some parts of these countries are from the capital level. But after the return of some level of security and stability, I think that was helpful to a lot of local organizations, international organizations working together and bringing back humanitarian aid, as well as social services, as well as healthcare. And there was that sort of concomitant approach to security, peace, and stability and development at the same time, rather than thinking of it as a sequenced approach. So there are, I think, examples like that where you can see those activities taking place simultaneously, and obviously that involves a lot of collaboration, but it's not something that's like necessarily planned out as it should, or there's no like strategic thinking behind how do we do this, because ultimately we are responding to conflicts and emergencies, and so that's an issue.
I don't know that specific example, but my guess is that those organizations had staff, local staff that were siblings or friends, or organizations that are led by people who are friendly or go to the same tea houses or something like that. I think the question for all of us moving forward is, how do you take those examples of where that worked at a local level and actually institutionalize that throughout both the H and the P and the D, or HDP. And I think that's one thing that we and policymakers are grappling with in creating this idea of a nexus is, okay, how do we take those successful examples from the local level and institutionalize them? You also mentioned armed groups, and so there's a question from the audience specific to conflict. And so Stephen, who used to work at USAID, asked, to what extent is conflict in the Sahel exacerbated by external actors? And so maybe I can start with the Mali context. I was recently in Ghana, and there's a lot of conversation about the Fulbe or Fulani, and are they being co-opted? Are they part of these armed groups, or are the armed groups taking, Burkina going left and right? And so would love your thoughts on this. To what extent is conflict in the Sahel exacerbated by external actors? Question.
Conflicts, first of all, conflicts in Mali are taking a turn where it's actually designed as tribal, as ethnic, and I think in a society that's what's the most dangerous in a society. For instance, in Mali, we have this issue of the Gan people and Fulani people fighting against each other. Those have been ethnic groups that have cohabitated or co-lived together for centuries and stuff. So now, the fact that those two ethnic groups are putting themselves against each other is very dangerous. And the locals of those ethnic groups leave their village, come to Bamako, and still cohabitate together in the refugee camps. So I think it goes beyond ethnic war, but that's only the image that we want to give it to and stuff. So the external influence on conflicts in Mali is very important, and especially the way media structures see it and how they interpret the reality of these things and stuff. So again, I think dialogue and communications and going on those localities to identify what the real issue is very important. One thing that Elena said is having the acceptance of the local communities, for instance. In Mali, you have to understand that each African countries have their own traditional reality and stuff. When you go to a locality, you have to, in Mali, for instance, you have to talk to chef de village, which is the chief of the village. Sit down and talk to them and, present your plan to them and have their accordance, their agreement to act upon their localities. So whether it's in a conflict zone or whether the conflicts come into place and stuff, I think this is very important, and it comes within the communication side of things, the dialogue side of things. So, yeah.
Quick follow-up, you mentioned France leaving Mali briefly.
Yes.
So thinking beyond regional actors and sort of neighboring actors to global actors, answer the same question if you don't mind.
If the fact that French left
Well,
Mali.
just to what extent is conflict in the Sahel exacerbated by global actors?
In Mali, for instance, there's this stereotype of France being the villain, right, in the Malian society. So the population had already actually started to believe that France was the problem of everything, that France brought war in Mali and stuff. But us as NGOs, we kind of realize today that the fact that France is going, France has always kind of been the focal points of Mali being connected to other European countries, for instance. So when France leave Mali, they actually push other international NGOs, other countries to leave Mali as well, because France was actually the one who brought them to Mali to, show them the Malian reality and stuff. So it's been hard for national NGOs because most of the financing that we receive was from French international organizations. So when those are blocked, our works are blocked as well. So we don't really have access to, financially or anything else to act upon those, the humanitarian aid that we want to do and things of that nature. So I don't know if I explained.
No, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
And that's actually an angle that is not talked about enough. So thank you for
All
bringing
right.
that in. Archie, can I go to you with this question?
Yeah, I think certainly external actors have exacerbated or contributed to conflict and tension in the Sahel. I think in particular, abusive practices by security forces I think is one sort of driver of sentiments of injustice. You know, where are my family members? You know, they were kidnapped or brought to prison without due process, and in often cases, national security forces from many countries in the Sahel might be supported by external actors like France, and now the Wagner Group, which come in with a very state-centric approach to securitization and stabilization, right? And it's let's just root out the insurgents or the jihadists and promote stability that way. That's not how it works. I mean, there are communities where jihadists are particularly embedded with local populations. As you both mentioned, they have found they tried to propose themselves as alternatives to the state, but certainly external actors have contributed to these trends, but at the same time, there's a state-centric approach that's used by the governments in the region to counter extremism and to counter violence. That's also their responsibility, and I think governments and militaries can be more mindful in improving that civil-military coordination, that dialogue with local populations, women and youth groups, and so forth, and inclusion in political processes. They'll lead people to have more trust in their state institutions. And also it depends, I guess, how you would define external, right? And you have some ethnic groups, for example, that might be at the border of a Chad and Sudan, and what's external and what's not, if they have kinship and really complex bounds across the borders. So, but in terms of global actors, I think certainly, yeah, and being more mindful in security assistance or in supporting counterterrorism or efforts, I think need to have a more holistic lens at engaging the communities, at building processes for a viable environment for peace and dialogue. I think those are really the critical ingredients for that.
Yeah, I mean, communities that live on borders that, oh, by the way, sometimes are a colonial construct that actually were meant to divide ethnically sort of uniform communities, or at least communities that have long historical traditions that are now cross borders. Elena, I want to come to you as well, but I want to give a heads up that we're running short on time. And so my last question is going to be about your final takeaway, ideally a tweet length takeaway from this conversation. But Elena, I want to how does this idea of external actors come into your analysis? I know you work more on the humanitarian side of the Nexus, but how does that, your analysis of the external actors play into the work that you do?
But humanitarians do love a good geopolitical analysis.
They do.
Especially if it's done by somebody else. I won't dwell too much on that because I think Archie gave the perfect answer and he speaks from a place of authority. But I want to bring to our collective attention a global trend that we're not speaking a lot about and has a very strong impact on humanitarian access and the humanitarian space, which is the curtailing of freedom and liberties. And I will go back to the country that I started this conversation from, which is Burkina Faso, a country in which the senior leader of the humanitarian community, the humanitarian coordinator, was declared persona non grata because they were accused of working along non-state armed groups. And after that, we saw this free fall of certain liberties and freedoms, with media being PNG'd as well from the country. We have fears of increased stigmatization and targeting of certain ethnic groups, with more and more attacks against civilians. And so this reticence to acknowledge that our negotiations for humanitarian access, so just for free, unfettered passage, to deliver humanitarian assistance is not recognized and is not encouraged is a trend that we're seeing not only in Burkina Faso, in a number of other contexts, but it's something that worries us. And so it's something that we also have to counter, right, with more principled humanitarian action. And that is particularly difficult when this gets tangled up with some of the elements and trends that Kumba was putting forward in terms of anti-French sentiment or anti-Western sentiment, or what Archie was putting forward as well, with states' prerogative of bringing security actors to respond to security challenges. So I think it's a little bit more complex, and I know we're running short on time, but it's a little bit more complex for us as humanitarians to look holistically at all of this. But there are multiple trends that are so intertwined that I think request yet another panel that I don't think we're going to have the time to do today.
Yeah, but here at CSIS we love panels, so I'm sure there
All
will
right.
be opportunity to do so. So Archie, let me start with you on sort of what's your final tweet length takeaway. Elena, maybe I'll come to you after that, and Kumba, I'd love to give the last word to you.
The length of tweet now has increased
Yeah,
significantly.
480 characters, so yes,
Okay.
it's slightly easier.
Okay. I thought it was 180 characters like before. But I think the main takeaway I think I got from this discussion and the importance of engaging local actors and supporting and investing inclusive political processes and build trust and build social cohesion. I think those are really important areas for this work. Ultimately, prevention, development, and humanitarian work are all interconnected, and I think it's important to keep having this lens, especially when we look at Sudan. I mean, it's a really interesting and dramatic example, but we need to continue that engagement and invest in dialogue. I think this is the key.
Can I have a thread?
Ooh, I've never been asked that question.
Well,
Sure.
Thank you. When I left Burkina Faso 2 years ago, where I was based and I was living, the last conversation I had was around my fear that Burkina Faso would go towards a Nigeria-like process, where humanitarians would only be allowed to work in garrison towns and to serve people and spaces that are under state control. And I warned very warmly my humanitarian colleagues of that free fall that we're assisting to. It was a very slippery slope, and we all saw it. And I don't think I have any prediction powers, but 2 years down the line, we slip a great deal down that slope. And climbing back is very, very hard. So I think our challenge is now to walk from these constraints that I put forward today, and many more that we didn't have the time to discuss, and climb back and restart again a conversation from a more principled space. Because the risk down the line is immense.
Kumba, last word to you.
My last word is that as a person from Mali, the Mali that I have always known is the Mali where, like Elena said last time, all roads led to. A Mali where strangers become family for a lifelong of time. A Mali where strangers can eat in the same plate, barehanded, without ever doubting each other. So I want to see that Mali back. And in order to have that, as Archie said, I think international NGOs and national NGOs have to work hand to hand. And I have written down some recommendations if you allow me to share those. I believe from the donors, from NGOs, everyone should keep supporting national NGOs' advocacy toward the authorities to guarantee a neutral, impartial, and operationally independent humanitarian assistance. Meeting with the authorities to push for the same arguments as the NGOs need for an acceleration of the validation process of avis de non-objection, because that's today one of the most difficult or procedure that every NGO is facing right now or are facing right now in Mali. We need to follow up closely the governors, the local authorities, requests to have NGOs activities pre-validated. So we have to work hand to hand. We have to go to that basis of the Malian hospitality where people work together to make the society better. Because that's the Mali that I know, where people pity each other. So whether it's from the society, the communities, everybody have to work hand to hand to actually, I would say, sensibilize the government to actually put aside that doubt that we have toward each other and stuff, and be supportive of each other. So that's the last thing that I would have to say for this panel. Yeah.
Archie, Elena, Kumba, thank you very, very much. Thank you to those who joined online, and if you're in the audience, please join me in thanking the panelists.